Start recording this. There we go. I'm gonna turn on my speakers I can hear. And also to share my screen. All right, so as I do begin, just a reminder that next week I will not be introducing any new material because next week is our final lecture exam. I suppose before I get to that though, I should at least remind you that I've posted our third lab exam last night on Ivy Learn. So if you go to Ivy Learn, you should be able to see under our quizzes or the assignments page, Lab Practical 3. So there it is. You'll have until Saturday, May 10th to complete it. That's the due date. And just like the last one, it is 50 questions, fill in the blank, and it covers everything from labs 11 to last week's lab. So parts of the neuron, parts of the spinal cord, the brain, the cranial nerves, the ear anatomy, the eye anatomy, and the reflex arc. So if I didn't go over it in lab, then you're not responsible for it. But anything I did go over in lab is definitely fair game and may very well be on the test. That brings us to our final exam, which is in the upcoming week. And just to go ahead and bring this on here, the final exam, just to remind you, is half comprehensive. So there is a comprehensive review guide that you definitely want to look for on Ivy Learn. And that'll cover all the different types of electrolytes, the pH, the organic molecules, things that we've covered throughout the semester that I think you will definitely find useful as you go into 102. So one half comprehensive. And the other half over chapter 11. Now, I will definitely not get through chapter 11 today. I will only probably get partway there. So wherever I get to, wherever we stop at, that'll be it for the test material. So we'll see how far we get. We'll see what we get to cover today. And if we don't get to it, well, it's not on the test. And as a reminder, it is 60 questions. So it's not like a big final exam. It is just a basic 60 question test, 120 points like the last exams. If you have any questions, comments, or concerns, don't hesitate to ask. And just to remind them, actually, before I forget, I am going to post a reminder to my CCL group because, not my CCL, my B1L group, that we're having class on here today, just to make sure everyone gets a chance to go on because they have trouble linking to it from my Zoom. There we go. And we'll do an invite. Copy. Then we'll go to B1L. It's one of the pains about having shared classes. I'll come to that in a second. Oops. There we go. As today at 9 a.m. And there we go. There. That way I can tell people I didn't say it. I didn't warn them. Where'd my chat box go? Alt-H. I bet it's hidden behind here. There we go. The announcement showed today and 2 more Mondays. Oh, yeah, I'll have to fix that. No, there are no more Mondays. I'll definitely be on here next Monday in case you guys want to review anything for the final exam. So next Monday, I will definitely be here. But the following Monday, I think that was just an error whenever I was doing the calendar. So, yeah. I'm glad you're able to use the announcements link. Perfect. Yeah, so I will be here for next Monday. I just won't actually be having a class. So if we want, we can do it for like a review for the final. All right, with that said, let's talk about where we were last week. So last week we finished with the spinal cord. So all of this was part of the spinal cord. This week, our goal is to cover the parts of the brain. So as you can imagine, the brain has many, many, many functions, and I'm not going to have you sit here and memorize all of these lists because we will talk about all the different locations in which these different memories, perceptions, sensory, motor skills are going through the brain. As you can imagine, the brain is the most complex organ. In fact, it's what I like to think of as the most complex structure in the entire known universe. There's an old, I forget who was it. It was in one of my animal classes. I think it may have been Darwin or something. Maybe not. I think it's Dawkins. Talking about the brain being the most complex structure in the entire known universe. Who can imagine why you would want to study anything else? I think that's very much true when we start thinking about the complexity of the brain. So as we start looking at the brain, we are going to just remind you, divide it into different areas. And this just kind of shows us the general area. So if you remember, the cerebrum is referring to this outer part of the brain, this whole big area down here. After we talk, well, we'll talk about the cerebrum last. But then we have the diencephalon. The diencephalon includes this area where we had the thalamus, the hypothalamus, and then the pituitary gland that was coming out from under here. That's the diencephalon. Cerebellum is that area towards the back. And then all of this down here was the brain stem, the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla. And what I like to do, the way I like to introduce the brain is I like to actually start at the bottom, at the medulla oblongata, since we just finished talking about spinal cord. And we're just going to kind of work our way up through the different levels. So with that said, we're going to start at the very base of the brain, the medulla oblongata, and just see what's going on there. And then just kind of add on new material as we work our way up towards the cerebrum. So if you have any questions, comments, suggestions, don't hesitate to ask. This is different than the book, by the way. The book organizes it differently. I shouldn't say they do now. Well, they do now, but they used to have it organized this way. And I prefer it this way, but your notes will have it this way. So that's how I'm going to introduce it. So we're going to begin right in the brainstem. And as we look, we're going to start for the medulla. And after we get to the medulla, we'll talk about the pons. And I'll also introduce the cerebellum with the pons because those two really go hand in hand together. And then we'll come up here towards that midbrain. So these are the three parts of the spinal cord: the midbrain, the pons, medulla oblongata. And as we begin looking at the medulla oblongata, the first thing I want to remind you is that this is derived from the myelencephalon. So myelencephalon. If you guys are recalling that we had the different vesicles, if you would, the secondary vesicles. So for example, let me just put this up here real quick. We had the, telencephalon, like this. Which gave rise to the cerebrum. And then down here we had this little diencephalon, like this, which gave rise to the diencephalon, the thalamus, the hypothalamus. And then we come down here and we have the mesencephalon, which will ultimately become the midbrain. The metencephalon, which gives rise to both the pons and the medulla. And then we had the myelencephalon. And this is where we're at here. Myelencephalon. I'm sorry, the pons and the cerebellum is what I meant to say from the metencephalon. The medulla is coming from this myelencephalon, and then a spinal cord. So that's just to remind us of where we're at from the development of the embryonic development point of view. We're in the myelencephalon. All right, with that said, let's go back to the medulla oblongata. And we can think of this as basically a part of the spinal cord that kind of just swells up and enlarges. It's about a 1-inch extension of the spinal cord. Now, there are a lot of functional areas in here, but the one that we're going to focus on first are what we call the medullary pyramids. And hopefully you guys remember a little bit about the medullary pyramids, because this is where the corticospinal tracts crossed over. Do you guys remember the corticospinal tracts? Corticospinal tracts. These are the tracts that were involved in voluntary movement. So when I move my right arm to wave at your camera like this, to wave at you guys, that'll be going through the medulla oblongata. And in the medulla, we have these structures called the pyramids. And these pyramids are where the fibers cross over. So we'll see these guys starting here, for example, on the left side. The motor neurons are up here. They come down, but then they cross over to the right side as they continue down. So when I was waving at you with my right hand, that was actually coming from the left part of my brain. So if you have a brain injury, just a reminder, let's say the brain injury is on the left side, that would actually affect my right hand. I would lose the ability to probably wave to you with my right hand. If I had a spinal cord injury on my left side, however, that would affect my left hand. So my right hand would be okay. So we talked a little bit about decussation, but that's what's going on in the medulla. Now, other important things in the medulla, we have some very important nuclei in here that help to keep you alive. So for example, we have cardiac centers. I should say centers because there's actually two of them. As the name implies, the cardiac centers maintain your heart rate. Now, I'll talk more about this with the cardiovascular system, but the heart itself is actually autorhythmic, which means you can cut the nerves to it and the muscle fibers, the cells themselves, will beat on their own, as long as it has a good blood supply. However, if you want to speed up the heart rate, if you want to slow it down, then we need the medulla oblongata. And so these are going to be helping you to increase or decrease your heart rate. Other important structures in the medulla oblongata include a vasomotor center. As the name implies, the vasomotor center is going to the smooth muscles in your blood vessels. So if you want to vasoconstrict your arteries, for example, make them smaller, that would increase your blood pressure. If you were to vasodilate your blood vessels, relax them, that would decrease the blood pressure. So by constricting or relaxing these muscles through the medulla, we can help to regulate the blood pressure. And of course, we also have respiratory centers. Right, respiratory, I should say centers again, because we have two of them in the medulla, but that's not a big thing. Respiratory centers, they monitor your rate and depth of breathing. So, you don't have to think about breathing. You just naturally do it, inhale, exhale. Your medulla is sitting there monitoring that. And I'll talk more about the interesting aspects of that with the respiratory system. So you'll notice that in the medulla, we're controlling your heart rate, your blood pressure, and your rate of breathing. As you can imagine, this is a very vital part of the brain. This is a part of the brain that is very primitive. I shouldn't say primitive, it's ancestral if you'd like, which means you'll see it through most animals, or many animals at least, and it helps to keep us alive. Damage to the medulla will typically be lethal. So damage to medulla is usually lethal. All right, those are the main things I want you to know for the medulla oblongata. As we move up, the next area or next stop is the metencephalon. And the metencephalon, just a reminder, will give rise to both the pons on the anterior surface here, or the ventral surface, and the cerebellum on the posterior surface. So we're going to add the pons and the cerebellum. I'll talk more about the cerebellum here in a second. But these two are coming from the same level, as we can see from this cross section. Now, when we start to think about the pons, the word pons itself is referring to a bridge, and that's because it's connecting the rest of the brain. So for example, let me bring in another screen here. Let's suppose I take a look at the brain here. Here's the cerebrum. Here's the midbrain. Here's the pons and the cerebellum, and then medulla oblongata. So here's the pons on the front, cerebellum on the back, and then the cerebrum up here. Now, depending on where you're at in the pons, the fibers go in different directions. For example, on the dorsal pons, the part that's back here, just put dorsal pons up there, these are having longitudinal fibers. What that means is that these fibers are coming from the spinal cord and from the lower brain. There might be sensory neurons, for example, and these neurons will be going up to the higher parts of the brain. They might be going to the thalamus, for example, and then ultimately to the cerebrum. So these longitudinal fibers going to, for example, the thalamus and then the cerebrum, they're longitudinal fibers to the higher brain. On the ventral surface of the pons, though, which will be over here, so we'll say this is our ventral pons, we have different fibers. These are called transverse fibers. And the transverse fibers are heading back to the cerebellum. So they're going to go like this and communicate with the cerebellum. I'll talk more about this later on, but that's a major passageway between the cerebellum and the rest of the brain. So these guys go to the cerebellum. And we can actually see this when we take a look at the pons. So here we are back at the pons. You can just kind of see this nice big swelling, and these fibers are making their major connections back to that cerebellum like that. And if you look at this pons from the front, now you can kind of see them going back like this. And unfortunately, the cerebellum's removed in that picture, but that's their final destination. So dorsal surface, longitudinal fibers to the higher brain, whereas the ventral surface is having those transverse fibers going to the cerebellum. Now, there are a few important pontine centers. One pontine center is a respiratory center that helps us with breathing. Now, you'll notice I said this about the medulla as well. We actually have a few different respiratory centers, both in the medulla and in the pons. The pontine respiratory center basically helps to keep you from over-inspirating or inhaling. You know, when you start to inhale like that, you start to breathe in. Your body should know when to stop. It shouldn't just keep going on and on and on. So there are certain stretch receptors that will basically tell you when it's time to stop breathing in and then to let your breath go. There are some other important pontine centers. I did not put them up here. Where did my sleep center go? I must have lost it. Oh, you know, I bet I forgot to move it. Let me find it real quick. That's okay. I'll just write it in. Sleep center is what I was going to say. It also has areas for sleep. So add the pontine respiratory center in and add a sleep center. That helps to regulate your basic sleep-wake cycle. All right, guys, while we're here in the pons and the telencephalon, we might as well go to the cerebellum. So the cerebellum we see is sitting just behind the pons and just below the cerebrum. And it's what we like to think of as the little brain. Even though it's a little brain, it has a large percentage of your neurons in the entire central nervous system. And it's largely involved in regulating motor activities and coordination. So think of balance, coordination, and posture when you're moving your body. Another important example of this, when I put practice and learning, think of this like a musical instrument. If you've ever tried to practice learning a new instrument, let's say to play guitar or to play the keyboard, you'll notice when you first start out, it's very difficult. Your fingers have to find the right spot and they have to hit it at the right time while your other finger perhaps plays the string. And then you move to the next finger, and then your next finger. While you're training those muscles before you can do it naturally, this is the cerebellum. It's teaching you how to do these movements nice and clear. Another great thing about the cerebellum, it helps you with your balance and coordination. So for example, I can close my eyes, and you guys can do this at home too. Just close your eyes and take your two fingers and bring them together naturally like this. And you can touch them without even looking. And that's the cerebellum coming to work. Now, I'll show you a little bit about the cerebellum here in a second, but just to show you a little bit about the anatomy, deep inside the cerebellum, we have this nucleus. It's called the dentate nucleus. And this dentate nucleus is going to be what's involved in monitoring your coordination, your balance. By the way, they call it dentate nucleus because it looks like a row of little teeth. So it looks something like this. Dentate, think of dentine, dental. It's a teeth-like nucleus. Now this is connecting to the rest of the brain through 3 cerebellar peduncles. And the cerebellar peduncles are these bridges that are going to go back and forth between the cerebellum and the rest of the body, or the rest of the brain. To understand how this works, I'm actually just going to, let's see, do I have room up here? I can do it up here, yeah. All right, I'll just put it up here. Imagine for a second we go back to our finger coordination, where you're bringing your fingers together like this. Well, to do that, the cerebellum is heavily wired to the muscles, to the skin outside your body. So let's suppose this is your brain. I'll make it nice and bigger. There's the brain. Here's the midbrain. Here's the pons. Oh, I'll just connect to the pons. And then here's the cerebellum, or there's the cerebellum on the back. So there's the pons on the front, there's the cerebellum on the back. And then this is the rest of the brain I drew in. Now here's the deal. Whenever you're dealing with a skeletal muscle, let's say this is one of our muscles in the limbs, there are certain stretch receptors inside these organs. They're what we call spiral organs. And these spiral organs are monitoring the tension of that muscle. And what they do is they transmit this information to the cerebellum. And it's going to go through what I call the inferior peduncle. So if we look over here, this is the inferior peduncle, and it will go to that dentate nucleus. And because of this, this inferior peduncle is telling your limb where it actually is. It tells the actual position of your limbs where they're at in space. So if you guys remember when I was talking about proprioception, I could close my eyes, I can hold my finger out like this, and my other hand out like this, and know exactly where they are without looking at them. That's going through the inferior peduncle. Now, when I decide to move, for example, to bring my fingers together like that, that's actually going to start way up here in the cerebrum, in what we call the precentral gyrus. I'll find my pen. There's my pen. So if you guys remember from the cerebrum, we had this area in the frontal lobe for voluntary movements. That's the upper motor neuron. And what's going to happen is it's going to come down here through the brain, through the pons, and it will ultimately go to your skeletal muscle as it comes down the spinal cord. As it does, though, it will give a connection to the cerebellum in the pons. There's a synapse here. And this synapse will then relay a copy of that information to the cerebellum. So it's always keeping track of our movements. You'll notice this is going through the middle peduncle. Now, the middle peduncle is what we like to think of as our desired position. It's a copy of the motor commands. I like to think of this as an efference copy, if you like. So this dentate nucleus is receiving 2 pieces of information. It's receiving your desired position, where you're trying to move to, going through the middle peduncle, And it's also receiving the actual position of the limb through the inferior peduncle. And what it's going to do is going to compare those values. If they're different, let's say my hands are like this, as I'm bringing them together, then it will make some corrections and it will correct those movements. So these corrective movements will be sent from the dentate nucleus. Let's say my nucleus is, and my pen right here, and it will go up through a superior peduncle, and that will go back up to the higher brain to correct those actions. So these will be corrective movements. So, and the superior peduncle is going to allow us to adjust our position so that we can actually have a nice, smooth movement. So there we have it, guys. The major peduncles connecting the cerebellum to the rest of the brain, allowing us to have these very nice, well-coordinated movements. Now, as you can imagine, with damage to the cerebellum, you're going to lose that coordination. You're going to lose your balance, perhaps. You might walk around like you're in a drunken stupor, even if you're perfectly sober, but you may have a hard time maintaining balance. And you may also have inaccurate movements. Let's say, for example, I want to reach for the camera. That's my webcam. Well, instead of reaching for it, I may overreach, I may underreach, I may go too far to the right, to the left. I may have a hard time reaching it, even though I can perfectly see it. So that, dear class, is an example of our cerebellum at work. All right, guys. With that said, let's move on up to the next level, the midbrain. And the midbrain, just a reminder, is derived from the mesencephalon. Mesencephalon is our midbrain. Now, as we start to look at the midbrain, if you were to take a section, let me just actually kind of draw it in here. Here's the midbrain here. If you were to take a section like this and look at it from the back, you're going to see 4 distinct bodies. There's 2 on top and 2 on bottom. 1, 2, 3, 4. So this would be a posterior view, or a dorsal view if you'd like. This whole thing is collectively called the corpora quadrigemina. I know it's a big name. Corpora refers to bodies. Quad means there's 4 of them. Gemina, if you guys are Geminis, any Geminis in class? The sign for Gemini means twins, they're paired. So we have a set of 4 bodies that are paired together. There's a pair on top and a pair on bottom. 1, 2, 3, 4. Now, the first pair that we see here are what we call the superior colliculi. A colliculus, by the way, is just referring to a hill. So it's like a little hill. Now, the superior colliculus is what we say is responsible for a visual reflex. So, for example, if you're trying to watch the birds in the sky and you see a bird flying across the sky and you're keeping your eye on it, that's the superior colliculus. Or if you're playing tennis, you know, when you're playing tennis, you have to keep your eye on the ball. You don't ever want to take your eye off the ball. Oh, table tennis, ping pong. Yeah, just like Forrest Gump. Never take your eye off the ball. He must have had some really great superior colliculi responsible for those visual reflexes. Now, just below this, we have these what we call inferior colliculi. Inferior colliculi are responsible for these auditory reflexes. So let's say somebody calls out your name. They'll say, hey, you. What's the first natural instinct? You're going to turn your head and look towards that direction once you hear your name. So what we're doing here is we're coordinating the auditory and the visual reflexes together to keep your attention on whatever is grabbing your attention. Whether you see it visually, which would be coming through that superior colliculus, or you hear it auditorily, or maybe a loud boom that makes you jump and then turn your head, that would be the inferior colliculus, auditory. All right. Now, on the front of the midbrain, here, we have have these structures called what's going on. Let me go ahead and actually just bring out the new screen. Let's suppose this is our medulla. Here's our pons. And then just behind the pons, you would, of course, have that cerebellum. So let's go ahead and add in the cerebellum here. And of course, let's add in our spinal cord. So there's spinal cord. Now, for clarity's sake, on the ventral surface of the medulla, we have those medullary pyramids. If you guys remember, the pyramids are what allowed the crossing over of your corticospinal tracts. So here, we will see the pyramids. And I'll come to those in a second. Now on the pons, when we look at the ventral surface of the pons, we had those transverse fibers. So these fibers were going back from the pons towards the cerebellum like this. So those are the transverse fibers that were making the major connections there. And now we're up at the midbrain. When we get to the midbrain, on the ventral surface, we have these kind of stalks. And these stalks, which look something like this, these are what we call cerebral peduncles. And what they do is they're the main passageway for those corticospinal tract fibers, for your motor fibers. So if you were guys to put, let's say we put the cerebral cortex up here like this. Oops. I don't really fit it there. But if you remember how we had the upper motor neurons and the lower motor neurons, up here, you'd be having those upper motor neurons. And what they do, actually, let me draw a different color so we can see it. I was hoping they had a pink up here. I'll see. We'll use orange. This upper motor neuron will be coming down, and they all go right through the cerebral peduncles like this. As it comes down, it will then go behind the transverse fibers through the pons, enter into the medulla, and here in the pyramid, it crosses over. So now it was starting up on the right side, now it's going to go over to the left side. And then it continues down the spinal cord like that. And that is your corticospinal tract. For voluntary movements. So just think about the cerebral peduncles. These are having the main passageway for the descending tracts or the corticospinal spinal tracts for voluntary movements. We'll put movements. So if you guys damage the cerebral peduncles, I want you to realize you will be damaging motor output. You may lose that ability to wave into the camera. You won't be damaging the sensory as much because sensory will be going up to the back of the brain. And just for completeness sake, if we were to start up here on the left side, you would have these motor fibers, these upper motor neurons. They'll come down through the cerebral peduncle. Once again, behind the transverse fibers. Now these guys will go through the medullary pyramid and they will cross over to the opposite side, just like that. All right, guys. So with that said, here we are looking at the cerebral peduncles. Notice here's the transverse fiber I was talking about in the pons. So there's the pons. Here's the medullary pyramids where we see them crossing over. So up here, you'd have those upper motor neurons. They're coming down like this through the cerebral peduncles, behind the transverse fibers, into the medulla, and then they cross over, just like that. So these are the major motor passageways for the higher brain. All right, now what we want to do is take a cross section through the midbrain, right about here. And this will be going through either the superior peduncle or the superior colliculus or the inferior colliculus. if you did, let's say you take a cross section like that, and I'll just kind of draw it out over here. It's basically what we see over here. On the back, we have our little bumps, bump, bump. Those would be the superior colliculi. And then on the front, you would have the cerebral peduncles. Something like this. Now it's worth noting in the middle of this, there's a fluid-filled cavity. We have this little channel. This channel is going right through the middle is the cerebral aqueduct. So I don't know if you guys can see this, but here's your third ventricle. Let me zoom in, that'll make it easier. And then down here is the fourth ventricle. And right in between those two is this cerebral aqueduct coming down. And so what we're doing is we're taking a cross section through it. All right. So there it is, the cerebral aqueduct. With the CSF in the center, CSF. All right. The thing is, in the middle of this area, when you do this, there are these dark staining areas here, like this. This is called substantia nigra. Now, substantia nigra is referring to this black substance, and it's highly pigmented. And these cells in the substantia nigra secrete this neurotransmitter, dopamine. Now, you guys may be familiar with dopamine as a feel-good, sense of well-being neurotransmitter. But in different parts of the brain, it does other things. And in this area, it's going to help facilitate voluntary movements. It basically allows you to initiate and terminate movements, to start and stop movements. So it allows you to start and stop movements. So on our picture over here, you can see a nice area where the substantia nigra is. Kind of where I was trying to show you. I mention this because in some patients, we have what Parkinson's disease, right? Parkinson's disease, what happens is this part of the brain, the substantia nigra, it begins to degenerate. And what happens is you lose this ability to initiate your movements and to terminate your movements. It becomes very difficult to start moving and to stop moving. So when you're thinking about Parkinson's disease, you can think about some of the things that start to happen. For example, when you're trying to rest your body, you'll have tremors. You'll start shaking, especially when you're trying not to move, because your skeletal muscles actually need a constant break or they will start to move on their own. So we're going to see these tremors at rest. Now you'll see a very typical handwriting. It'll start to get smaller and smaller and smaller, where you can see this kind of this rigidity in their writing and in their movements as well. Other things that you'll notice is they have a very typical gait. You'll find that Parkinson's patients, it can be very difficult to start moving, to start walking. And as soon as they start walking, they'll have this kind of shuffling gait. And once they start walking, they'll also find it very difficult to stop walking. So, poor muscle control, difficulty walking, speaking, gait, this is all with Parkinson's disease, which is primarily occurring at the substantia nigra. I'll introduce the basal nuclei later on, but they will also be affected as well. But the substantia nigra is the big guy. With that said, guys, let's move on up to the diencephalon. As we move to the diencephalon, just a reminder that it's going to give rise to several of these structures right here. The thalamus, the hypothalamus, even the eyes themselves. The retina of the eyes is a protrusion, is an extension of the diencephalon. A lot of people like to think of your eyes as the extensions of the brain into the actual world itself. Mammillary bodies we won't talk about, so you don't need to worry about those. Parts of the pituitary gland and the pituitary stalk will be there, and we'll also see the pineal gland there. So with that said, let's start right with the thalamus. As we start looking at the thalamus, the first thing you should remember is that the thalamus is the major sensory relay center. So if we look in here, all of the senses that are going up to the higher brain will first pass through the thalamus. So for example, if your eye is right here, right, let's say there's an eye, you will have these visual pathways from the retina. They will go back to the thalamus, where we have a synapse from the thalamus, and then it will be sent to the occipital lobe towards the back. If, on the other hand, you have a touch receptor, let's say this is from your fingertip, and let's say you're just touching something, well, then we will have sensory neurons that bring this information from our touch receptors up here. It will then go to the thalamus here, and from the thalamus, we will have projections towards the parietal lobe, where we have the sense of general touch. So the thalamus is what we like to think of as this major sensory relay center, where it's basically receiving all of the different senses. Now, the only exception to this is smell. I'll talk more about smell later on, but that's going to an area called the limbic system, and that will also be stimulating your memories. All right, so there it is, our thalamus. Like I said, reflex center or relay center, relaying it to the area of the cerebral cortex. The next area we should look at is the hypothalamus. Now, the hypothalamus is a small part of the brain, no bigger than my pinky fingernail, very, very small. And yet, if you guys remember, this is controlling a lot of our homeostatic mechanisms. So, guys, you recall from our very first lecture, we talked about how the body temperature was at 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit. Actually, side note, it turns out it's actually cooler than that now. Over the past several years, our body temperatures have apparently been cooling down. I forget what the average is now, but it's slightly lower than 98.6. But anyway, our thermostat, if you would, the part of the brain that's keeping it at 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit is the hypothalamus. But not only that, it also has other homeostatic mechanisms. For example, your heart rate, your blood pressure. You want to make sure you have the right blood pressure, your sense of thirst, your hunger. You want to make sure you have the right electrolyte balance, the right blood sugar levels. That's the hypothalamus. Are you in a good mood, a bad mood? You know, when you get hungry, for example, if you're not regulating your hunger, what kind of mood are you in? You're angry, right? Yeah, you get hangry. That's why if you have a spouse that's working maybe they're at work and you want to do a big favor whenever they get home, or maybe they want you to do a big favor, and you don't just ask them right away when they're hungry because they're in a really bad mood, they're all grumpy. You wait and you feed them first, right? And then after you guys have had dinner and they're nice and relaxed and they're calm, then you can ask for the favor. That's why whenever you see engagements, right? Like marriage engagements, you don't just ask them to marry you right away. You take them out to dinner, you woo them a little bit, you feed them, you make them in a good mood. So there it is, your moods and emotions in the hypothalamus. Even if you guys remember sexual orientation, sex drive, is in here in the hypothalamus. So I always say people's sexual orientation, you have no more control over that than your sense of hunger, your sense of thirst, your body temperature. It is not an actual rational decision up here in the higher brain. It is a homeostatic mechanism maintained way down here in this nice, very important thermostat part of the brain. Now, I'll talk more about how it regulates the endocrine activity later on with the endocrine system. As we can see here, there are major connections between the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland. And this system here will be regulating your body's activity for the endocrine system as well. So there we have it, guys, our hypothalamus. Oh, did I not put my pineal gland up there? All right, well, we can write pineal gland in here while we're here. Do I have a good place for it? Yeah, oh, perfect, there's a place. Since I don't have my pineal gland listed, just a reminder, I'll go ahead and introduce it here. Here's this little gland right back here behind the thalamus. That, of course, is the pineal gland. And you should remember that the pineal gland, the pineal gland secretes a very important hormone called melatonin. And that will be helping to monitor your sleep-wake cycle. Oh, let's make this tired. Or it makes you awake. Sleep-wake cycle. Interesting side note, by the way, a major stimulus for the secretion of melatonin turns out to be darkness. So when it's nice and sunny like it is right now, bright outside, melatonin levels should be low. They should go down. However, as it approaches darkness, as the sun starts to fade and darkness falls, then your melatonin levels will start to go up. So it's actually inhibited by light going through the eyes. I can mention that because they always say if you want to get a good night's rest, make sure you shut off all electronic devices like 30 minutes before bedtime, turn the lights down. That way your melatonin levels can go up a little bit and you'll get nice and relaxed if you're having trouble falling asleep. With that said, guys, now we leave the diencephalon and move on to the cerebrum. As we look at the cerebrum, you can see it's involved in many different things. We're all going to have this sensory and perception, right? All of your different senses, whether it's vision, hearing, smell, touch, pressure, pain, they will be going to this cerebrum. In addition, voluntary movements. So when I decide to wave at the camera to you, that will be initiated at the cerebrum. Then we have what we call these association areas. When we talk about association areas, these are areas responsible for coordinating activities, functioning, planning, reasoning, higher intelligence. It allows you to know what's going on, to interpret an event. I'll talk more about these association areas as we move forward, but this is how we're going to divide the cerebrum. We'll have number one, sensory perception. Number two, initiate motor output. And number three, association areas, which I just like to think of as higher intellect. Right. Reasoning, mood, problem solving, judgment, ethics, all of those things are a part of the cerebrum. So as we begin looking at the cerebrum, the first thing you'll notice is that we divide it into two cerebral hemispheres, a left hemisphere and a right hemisphere. And going right down the middle, we have this nice longitudinal fissure that separates the two cerebral hemispheres. If you were to take a section of the cerebrum like this, and let's say this is an anterior view. So this might be the right hemisphere. This would be the left. Just a reminder that inside the cerebral hemispheres, we have our ventricular system. I'll come back to the ventricles a little bit later on. But here is a lateral ventricle in the left hemisphere, or in the right hemisphere. Here's a lateral ventricle in the left. And then these two will join together and empty into a third ventricle. And then from the third ventricle, we will go down to the cerebral aqueduct where it opens up into a fourth ventricle. I'm not interested in the ventricles right at this point, but I did want to make a nice important point here, and that is this, that the left and the right brain will be communicating with each other. We have this outer area of the gray matter, right? These are the cell bodies. and they'll be sending their projections down to the sides like this. But then they will also be having myelinated axons, and these axons will be crossing over from one side to the other like this. And they all come through this little bridge of white matter. This is what we call the corpus callosum. You guys remember from the view, the side view, the corpus callosum, what this does is these are nerve fibers that join the two cerebral hemispheres together. Now, just a reminder, as we're looking at the surface, I'll put a blank screen here just so I have a little more room. You'll notice that it's highly convoluted, like this, bump, 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 right? And each of these bumps is called a gyrus. Now, if you have more than one, then we say gyri. That's the plural version. And then the depressions in between, each one is called a sulcus. And of course, if you have more than one, we would call it sulci. Some people say sulci. Either way, sulci is the plural. All right. So as we start looking at the parts of the cerebrum, the outer part, or the bumps, or the gyri, the depressions are the sulci. And just a reminder, the main reason we do this is to help increase surface area. Out here along the edge, we have the cerebral cortex. That's the outer area of gray matter where we see the body, or the cell bodies, the neurons. And you notice by folding it up, we're able to pack a lot more cells into a lot smaller space. So that's the cerebral cortex. And that's where we actually find about 75% of all neurons in the entire nervous system are in this thin outer layer. By the way, I want you to think to yourself, cerebral cortex, should we classify this as gray matter or white matter? And hopefully you're thinking to yourself, this should be gray matter. Gray matter is unmyelinated, and we do not myelinate cell bodies. Now, connecting the cerebrum to the rest of the brain, we will then have all these neurons coming down like this, forming these major passageways that fill up a lot of the inside of the brain. All of these axons that are myelinated, this will be forming the white matter. I'll talk more about this in detail later on. But white matter is myelinated. Now, just a reminder, as we start looking through the brain, in some areas, let's say this is all white matter, you will have a cluster of cell bodies all packed together inside the white matter, like this. So you're gonna see these little dark spots. There's a dark spot. There's a dark spot. These little collections of gray matter inside the white matter, those are called nuclei or nucleus. So a nucleus is a cluster of the cell bodies. In the central nervous system, and that is referring to that little group right there. All right, guys. With that said, we're going to take a little break here before we work our way through the actual parts of the cerebrum. So this is just a reminder, gyri is referring to the bumps, sulci referring to the depressions. And what we'll do is we'll start it right here. Let's do a 5-minute break. What time is it? Yeah, 5-minute break. And then we'll come back here and finish up the cerebrum. I'll see you in a few. go. Let's see where we're at. All right. So as we begin looking at the cerebrum, minimize this. There we go. Just a couple of notes that we'll see part of the meninges. If you guys remember, the meninges is having this outer thick layer of the dura mater. And this dura mater will form these nice impressive folds that separate the two cerebral hemispheres. Here's one, the falx cerebri, and that will separate the right and the left hemispheres. And then there's another one that separates the cerebellum from the cerebrum, tentorium cerebelli. Now, I'm not going to hold you responsible for these, but whenever we do our brain dissections, unfortunately, since we can't dissect the brains, I always like to point them out because they are quite impressive to see, at least. All right. As we start looking at the cerebrum, we will, of course, divide it into 4 lobes, and hopefully remember from our brain anatomy the name of these 4 lobes. So here we have the frontal lobe in the front and the parietal lobe just behind it. Just a reminder that separating these 2 lobes, we have a very important sulcus right here called the central sulcus. So central sulcus. Then we have the temporal lobe off to the side, and separating the temporal lobe from the parietal lobe and the frontal lobe, we have a lateral sulcus. So lateral sulcus over here. And then, of course, in the very back, we have the occipital lobe for the visual areas of the brain. Now, you will notice, I'll talk about this a little later on, there is an area, a little lobe collectively called the insula. And the insula is just kind of deep inside this temporal lobe here, if you were looking there. So if you're looking in the deeper cerebrum, we will talk more about this little extra area called the insula. So guys, with that said, just a reminder that the cortex is referring to this outer part of gray matter. So we can see a nice dark area right here where all of these cell bodies reside. And then connecting to the rest of the brain, we have the white matter. So all of this area nice and light, that of course will be the white matter. And in some areas of the cerebrum, you'll see deep inside that white matter, these clusters of gray matter right here, right there, these areas here. And these are different nuclei. Nuclei are clusters of cell bodies deep within the white matter. So that, trying to figure out, there we go. Let's talk about the functional areas of the cerebrum. Now, just a reminder that we're going to divide this into 3 areas. The sensory areas that are receiving the information from the lower central nervous system and from your receptors. The motor areas that begin in the cerebrum, and then that will then go out and innervate different muscles and different glands. And association areas are those that are going from one part of the cerebrum to the other. So for example, if we were to take a look at the cerebrum like this, obviously sensory would be coming up from the outside, like so, and motor would begin up here in the cerebrum and go down. But then we're gonna have a lot of areas that are either connecting from the frontal lobe to the parietal lobe like this. They might be connecting from the right side and the left side, or they might be going somewhere like this. These areas that are not going out of the central nervous system, that are completely in the central nervous system, these are the association areas. So these are the parts that are responsible for your thoughts, emotions, higher intellect, critical thinking, things like that. They're not really sensory or motor. They're completely composed of what we call the interneurons. I don't know if you guys remember interneurons, but interneurons are those completely in the central nervous system. All right, guys, let's just start right in the frontal lobe then with the parts of the frontal lobe. As we do, here is our central sulcus. And the first thing to think about with the frontal lobe is that it's primarily dealing with motor output, and it will also have higher intellect. So let's do the frontal lobe. Let's do it in red. I always like my motor to be red. So motor output and higher intellect. Now, the first thing you'll notice in the motor lobe is right in front of the central sulcus. So if you look at that central sulcus here, we have what we call the precentral gyrus. And the precentral gyrus is what we like to think of as the primary motor cortex. So for example, when I decide to wave to you in the camera, I want to plan that coordination and I want to plan that activity. And now that planning, it starts in that precentral gyrus. So there it is, our precentral gyrus for your voluntary movements. Now, another area that you'll notice in the frontal lobe, and I've had it back there, but I'll go ahead and show it up here, is in this left hemisphere, right towards the front, called the Broca's area. And the Broca's area is what we like to think of a motor speech area. It helps you to plan your speech. So it coordinates your mouth, your tongue, your pharynx in order to form speech. So this will allow you to coordinate your mouth for speech. Now, I like to mention this because some people have what we call a Broca's aphasia. You might have a stroke that damages this part of the brain. And when you damage this part of the brain, you may find it very difficult to form speech. You can understand what other people are saying. You can read just fine. You can write, or you can see the words just fine. You can hear them just fine. But if you want to actually make a sentence, if you want to communicate with somebody else, you may find it very difficult to actually form nice, coherent sentences. And this is what we would call a Broca's aphasia. You might be able to say individual words, but stringing them together fluently and coherently would be very difficult indeed. And one other area in the frontal lobe I'd like to introduce you to is what we call the prefrontal cortex. That's all the way in the front right here. And this prefrontal cortex is what we like to think of as the higher intellect. So for example, you guys decided to attend class today. You made that decision using your prefrontal cortex. Was it a good decision? You can be the judge of that using your prefrontal cortex. If you need to solve a math problem when you complete a test, you will be using your prefrontal cortex. So any type of decision-making skills, planning, judgment, all of that is here in this little part of the brain. It always reminds me because I don't know if you guys ever watched One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest or maybe read the book, but in the movie, Jack Nicholson, yeah, he always says this, causing a little bit of trouble. And what do they do to calm him down? Spoiler alert, they give him a frontal lobotomy. Guess which part of the brain they're going to be knocking out with a frontal lobotomy? Prefrontal cortex. And then you lose that ability. You're still there, you're still functional, but you're just, yeah, might as well be a vegetable, I guess. All right, now as we move back to the parietal lobe, the parietal lobe is going to be the main sensory input area, so at least for the general senses. So what we like to think of right behind the central sulcus, we have the postcentral gyrus. And here we can see the postcentral gyrus right here. And we like to think of this as what we call the somatosensory cortex. Now, when I talk about somatic senses refers to your general senses. These are the senses that we feel all across the body, whether it's the sense of temperature, pressure, pain, vibrations. Those are the somatic general senses. So pressure, touch, proprioception would be a good example. Pain, temperature, etc. So all of those general senses will be going to the parietal lobe, to that postcentral gyrus for perception. Now, I do want to point out there's another area back here, and it actually has both sensory components and association components. Wernicke's area. Some people call it Wernicke's area. Some people call it the Vernix area. Either one's fine. And this occurs at the junction between the parietal lobe, the temporal lobe, and the occipital lobe. And as we start to come back here, you're going to see this part of the brain is what I like to think of as the Wernicke's area or the Vernix area. We like to think of this as a sensory speech area. And it's a sensory speech area because it allows you to understand speech. So hopefully you can understand the words that are coming out of my mouth. Hopefully you can understand the words and read the words that are on the page right now because you're using your Wernicke's area. I always like to mention, this is probably a few years ago now, but there's a neuroscientist on the radio. She was talking about having a stroke herself, and she realized it because picking up the newspaper, brought it in, she looked at it, and she couldn't read any of the words. It didn't even look like a language. It looked like alien writing, and that was an indication that there was something going wrong with the Wernicke's area. So sensory speech area. So with the Wernicke's aphasia or Wernicke's aphasia, you may lose the ability to understand language. It may not be, whether it's spoken or whether it's written, you may lose that ability. Now, I like to mention that the Wernicke's area is also known as a central integration center. And what that means as being a central integration center, it's integrating all of your senses together. So your sense of touch, smell, vision, it's going to be bringing in your past memories for comparison. And that allows you to understand what's going on to evaluate a situation. You know, if you go, for example, to a family member's funeral, you'll notice a lot of people might be standing around. They're maybe sad, maybe some are happy, but they're all talking. You know that these people are there. You recognize the your loved one in the casket or in the urn or wherever they put them. And you see the food, you see the general vibe of the event. That's the Wernicke's area, right? It brings these sensory areas together so that you know it's probably not a good idea at that time to stand up and start telling jokes to make it like a comedy club, because you shouldn't be able to read the sense of the room, the vibe of the room. That's the Wernicke's area. Or for example, if I was going to say, if we were together in a classroom, somebody walks in the classroom, hopefully they could understand that this was a class, probably not a good time to interrupt. All right, so those are the parts of the parietal lobe. So frontal lobe, motor output, higher intellect, parietal lobe, general sensory, and we also have this interpretation of what's going on. Now with that said, let's go ahead and add on the other lobes. The temporal lobe, as you guys can imagine, is responsible for hearing. So hearing is going to be right next to the ears, and they will go to the temporal lobe. Although oddly enough, it's that the left temporal lobe is actually receiving input from my right ear, whereas my right temporal lobe is receiving it from my left ear. But definitely hearing and smell as well. Smell is going to go to an area called the limbic system that's inside the temporal lobe. I'll talk more about that later on, but in here we have a limbic system for smell. All right, association areas, just so you guys remember, the understanding of speech pattern. Oh, the temporal lobe. This is a good one. If you ever get an earworm stuck in your head, you're gonna hate me for this, but baby sharka doo 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 doo, mama sharka doo 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 doo, and it just gets stuck. And that pattern cannot get out of your head. You can thank your temporal lobe for that. Yeah. So any type of repetitive motions like that, and you have a song that you just can't get rid of, that's your temporal lobe. As we look towards the occipital lobe, areas back here will have a visual cortex. As the name implies, it's responsible for vision. It's allowing you to see. In addition, though, we also have visual association areas, and these are allowing you to recognize things. For example, facial recognition. It turns out that seeing somebody's face and actually recognizing that face are two different things that the brain needs to interpret. They're two different problems. And I don't know if you guys have ever heard of Oliver Sacks, but he writes these different things about different neurological defects. And in one of his writings, he had the man who mistook his wife for a hat. The man who mistook his wife for a hat. So this was they were at this neurological counseling area. He had some type of defect going on here. And apparently as they was leaving the room, he tried to take his wife, pick her up and put her on his head, thinking of her as a hat because he did not have this ability to recognize faces, family members, things like that. So there you have it, guys, the occipital lobe. All right, just a real quick thing as we look at the cerebrum. You guys may have heard of this, whether you're using your left dominant or the left hemisphere or the right hemisphere, most people will be using typically the left. And when we start thinking about the dominant hemisphere, which is usually the left, this is going to be primarily dedicated to analytical tasks. So whether you're trying to calculate numbers, do a math problem, whether you're reading, writing, these analytical skills are in the left hemisphere usually, right? Because they're the dominant. The right hemisphere is typically more dedicated to emotional aspects. Maybe you like some art, you like music, right? Or intuitive thoughts. Maybe these are the things you know you have a gut feeling about something. You don't want to analyze it, you just know. You know because you know. Yeah, this is mostly in the right hemisphere, the non-dominant hemisphere for most people. And this is just a reminder that the two hemispheres will need to communicate with each other. So if we're looking here, you can see this nice pattern of the white matter that allow the left and the right hemispheres to communicate. This is, of course, the corpus callosum. All right, that's enough for the cerebral cortex. Now I want to introduce a couple structures deep inside the cerebrum. If you look deep inside the cerebrum, you're going to see a group of very large nuclei, these big areas of gray matter. These are collectively called the basal nuclei. By the way, they're often called the basal ganglia. In fact, you will still see this in some textbooks. But hopefully you guys are realizing that calling them a ganglion is inappropriate because we are in the central nervous system, while ganglia should be in the peripheral nervous system. So I'm going to just call them basal nuclei. Now these big areas of gray matter, you don't need to know which ones they are, the caudate nucleus, the putamen, the globus pallidus, don't worry about that. What I want you to know is that they're all secreting dopamine. And this dopamine, once again, is facilitating your voluntary movements. Now, we've talked about this before. We've mentioned another part of the brain down in the midbrain. Let's say here's our midbrain. Something like this. And in the midbrain, we had those areas called substantia nigra. So there's my substantia nigra, there's my substantia nigra. There are major passageways that connect these guys together. And what happens in Parkinson's disease is that this whole passageway will get cut. So just a kind of reminder of that with the Parkinson's disease, it will affect both the basal nuclei, which are responsible for voluntary movements, as well as the substantia nigra. And this is primarily due to the deficiency of the dopamine. Right? So as this part degenerates, less and less dopamine gets released, and you're basically cutting the brake lines to your muscles, and then they just start going on their own. So that, dear class, will do it for the cerebrum. Final part of the brain I want to talk about today. If you look deep inside, we have a group of cells collectively, or a group of areas collectively known as the limbic system. Now, as we start looking at the limbic system, this is a part of the brain that's involved in forming motions, emotions, memory, and also evaluates your mood. So, memory, emotions, and mood. Oh, there it is down there. We don't need to know this part up here. And what we want to see is that it's deep inside the cerebrum, primarily in the telencephalon. And another important thing about the limbic system, it's strongly stimulated by smell. You ever go to maybe a family picnic? No, this is a great example. I smelled a very familiar smell outside the other day. I don't know if it was moss or something, but once I smelled it, I recognized it. I knew it from a childhood memory, and it brought back a memory of me being at my grandmother's house in her backyard. I thought, I know that smell from when I was a kid. And that was a trigger from my limbic system, bringing back a good childhood memory. All right, as we look at the limbic system, we're going to look at three main structures. The first part is called the cingulate gyrus. And the cingulate gyrus goes right around the corpus callosum. So just a reminder here, let me bring in my little pen. Here is our corpus callosum. That's the area of white matter that connects the two hemispheres. But now you'll see this green area that rides right around it. This green area is the cingulate gyrus. And this is often thought of as a satisfaction center. We call it a satisfaction center because it pairs an activity with the sense of satisfaction. So, you know, when you're eating a really good meal and you enjoy that meal and you feel satiated, that's the limbic system, or that's the cingulate gyrus. Or with good sex, you have a nice strong orgasm and then you feel satisfied after the orgasm, that's the cingulate gyrus. So whether it's dealing with food, sexual satisfaction, anything like that, that's the sensation that you'll get when you pair doing a certain activity with the satisfaction of it. Now, you'll notice in some individuals that this part gets damaged, and we often see this in schizophrenia. So there seems to be schizophrenia. Some damage here, along with other disorders, but you may notice an unusually high sex drive, a voracious appetite, where you don't get that quite linkage together with the satisfaction with the activity. And so you just keep doing the activity over and over and over and over again, seeking the satisfaction, but not quite receiving it. So that is the cingulate gyrus. Now, as we move out into the temporal lobe, you're going to notice another part of the brain called the hippocampus. And the hippocampus is this nice dark purple area that's kind of going out into the temporal lobe, right here. It looks something like this. And this hippocampus is involved in memory consolidation. What that means with memory consolidation, it takes your short-term memories and converts them into long-term memories. So right now, with short-term memory, those are the things that you probably remember within maybe a minute or so, if that. For example, you probably don't remember the things I said 2 minutes ago. That's because it's left the short-term memory. But there are some things that you remember way back from when you were a child. Those things that you remember from childhood, those are long-term memories. And so what you're going to have to do is somehow consolidate some of the short-term memory. You don't obviously consolidate all of them, but you consolidate some of them and you bring them into long-term. That's what the hippocampus does. Has a major role in memory. Taking the short-term memory and bringing it into the long-term. Also, spatial awareness. Where are you at in space? If you were to get lost, how could you find your way home? Would you know what landmarks to look for? That's another important thing with the hippocampus. Now, I like to mention the spatial awareness and the memory because this part of the brain, this hippocampus, is the first part that begins to degenerate with Alzheimer's disease. And so as you can imagine with Alzheimer's disease, you start to maybe get lost in space. Where am I at? You suddenly don't realize, how do I get back home? Or you maybe forget people's faces, or you don't recognize, you don't remember them quite as well, or you don't remember a specific memory. That's the Alzheimer's disease affecting the hippocampus. All right, so that's for memory consolidation. Now, I like to point out at the end of the hippocampus, we have this other area called the amygdala. The amygdala, which is actually referring to an almond-shaped body, is this area right here at the edge of the hippocampus. And what it does is it attaches emotion to a memory. attaches emotion to a memory. Here's a great example. Let's say you're walking down the street and you see somebody coming towards you. Well, you see them using your visual cortex and you recognize that person. You recognize that person using your visual association in the occipital lobe. And then you remember that person, and you remember that person using your hippocampus. And then you remember that person borrowed $100 from you last month, promised to pay you back, swore on it, and never paid you back. And now your rent's due and you can't pay it. How does seeing that person make you feel? You probably get that pit of anger. Arrgh. Yes, that, dear class, is the amygdala. It is attaching an emotion to that memory. They did you wrong. They caused you harm sometime in the past, and you're going to remember that. So whether it's a person you like your dear grandmother, or a person you dislike, that's going to be the limbic system or the amygdala. I should also mention that this part of the brain is responsible for what I call primal fears. You guys know primal fears: your fear of heights, your fear of flames, your fear of insects, your fear of fire, your fear of snakes, your fear of snakes on planes. Anytime you have that kind of fear that you have to overcome, that's the amygdala. Now, the way I like to think of it is like this. The amygdala is the part of the brain that's trying to keep you alive. You know, you come across a bridge that might be 200 feet over a cliff, and you look over the cliff and your heart jumps out of your throat. That's the amygdala telling you you're way too high up. Don't even think about it. What you have to do to overcome that fear then is use your frontal lobe, the prefrontal cortex, to rationalize and say, you know what, this looks safe. This is okay. I can do this. It's nothing to worry about. But then your amygdala is sitting there telling you, no, dummy, you're going to get yourself killed. You're going to get me killed. Don't do it. So if you think about phobias where you have these irrational fears, sometimes it's harder to overcome this part of the brain, because this part of the brain is very ancient. It's very ancestral. It's kept many of our ancestors alive, whereas the frontal cortex has not been doing such the same. So there you have it, guys, the major parts of the limbic system. And that will complete the central nervous system. Now, with that said, I'm only going to add a couple things with the peripheral nervous system. So this is just a summary of the major parts of the brain, from the cerebrum, basal nuclei, diencephalon, that is the thalamus, hypothalamus, pituitary gland, midbrain, pons. I'm not going to go over all these because we just covered them all. But that's pretty much what we've talked about for most of our lecture for today. Now, with that said, a quick note about the peripheral nervous system. As you guys should remember, the peripheral nervous system is coming off the central nervous system. So if we have the central nervous system over here, that was composed of the brain, like this, and the spinal cord. Now, coming off the brain and the spinal cord, we have the peripheral nervous system. And the peripheral nervous system, oops, my ink right, there we go. Peripheral nervous system, PNS. That was composed of 12 pairs of cranial nerves that come off of the brain. So here we see some of the cranial nerves are coming from the brain. And then coming off the spinal cord, we have 31 pairs of spinal nerves. So that's the idea with the peripheral nervous system. I'll talk more about the somatic division and the autonomic divisions later on. Just a reminder that somatic division is voluntary control. Whereas the autonomic division is involuntary. So we'll see that later on. The part I want to get in your heads right now, though, is what is a nerve? And really, a nerve is a bundle of axons. So if we were to take a nerve and if you look inside this nerve, we have a bunch of axons all bundled together. Actually, let me go ahead and draw it out. So we can just all kind of see it together. There we go. All right. So let's suppose here's our central nervous system, the brain, and the spinal cord. And what we're going to do is just take off one of these nerves. And here is a nerve. You know what? I want to make it even bigger. Make it nice and big. There we go. And when you're looking in a nerve is basically a bundle of axons. But the axons themselves are not just bundled all willy-nilly. They're actually packed together in very distinct ways. So if you look inside the nerve through a cross section, you're going to see that the nerve axons themselves are packed together in what we call fascicles. So inside here and here, we have these structures called fascicles. And a fascicle is a bundle of axons. Inside the nerve. Right. So each one of those is a fascicle. We can take that fascicle, remove it, kind of blow it up. And then inside this, you would of course have then your axons. So inside here, you would actually have the axons of the neurons. Now, just a reminder, guys, that these axons might be myelinated. And so if they're myelinated, then you would see these Schwann cells around them. So let me just put a couple Schwann cells here around the axon. There's a Schwann cell. And here's another one. Just like so. And of course, in between the Schwann cells, you would have that node of Ranvier. Now, the thing I would like to point out is that each of these layers within the nerve and around the nerve is bundled by a layer of connective tissue. We have these different connective tissue coverings. So to show you some of these coverings, the first one that we'll look at completely surrounds the nerve itself. So outside the nerve, there's this layer of connective tissue that's bundling this whole thing together. This is called the epineurium. Epineurium surrounds the entire nerve. But then inside the nerve, each fascicle itself gets its own layer of connective tissue. This is called the perineurium. The perineurium surrounds each fascicle. So here's the perineurium around this fascicle here. Here it is around this guy and this guy. And then all of this would be surrounded by that perineurium as well, packing it together. And last but definitely not least, each individual axon then itself is covered by its own layer of connective tissue, just like this. This is called the endoneurium, and that will be around each of these axons. So the endoneurium surrounds each axon. Hopefully, guys, this looks very familiar because this is exactly the same structure, the same way that muscle fibers were organized together. You organize them into fascicles, and then all those fascicles were packed inside the entire structure itself. Same thing with the axons. So that's what we're looking at then when we look at here. So here we see the fascicle with the perineurium around it. Here's the axon and the Schwann cell with the endoneurium around it. And here's the entire nerve itself with the epineurium around it. So that is the basic organization of a peripheral nerve. Now, with that said, let's talk nerves. Now, I'm not going to go over the classification of the nerves. Just know that most nerves are mixed. What that means is that they have both sensory and motor fibers going through them. So if you damage a nerve, at least a spinal nerve, you will lose both the motor output and the sensory input. So for example, let's say I damage the nerves going to my hand. And now instead of waving to you guys, my hand is just kind of limp, right? I can't extend my hand anymore. I've damaged the nerves. But not only that, you will also lose the sensory of that area. You won't be able to feel the sense of touch, pressure, or pain to those nerves. All right, don't worry about nerve classification on this end. I'm just going to put a big X through that. We're not going to talk about that today. What I want to talk about are the main spinal nerves. We've already talked about this in lab, the cranial nerves discussed in lab. So I'm not going to worry about those in lecture. You can cross those all off. And since we already know the 12 pairs of cranial nerves, what I want to do today is start by talking about the spinal nerves. I'll show you what's going on with there real quick. So we don't need cranial nerves. We want spinal nerves. Now, as we look at the spinal nerves, this is just a reminder, we typically label them by the level of the spinal cord that they come off. So if you guys remember, there are 31 pairs of spinal nerves. We have 8 pairs of cervical nerves, C1 through C8, 12 pairs of thoracic nerves, T1 through T12, 5 pairs of lumbar nerves, L1 through L5, 5 pairs of sacral nerves, S1 through S5, and 1 pair of coccygeal nerve, which we'll label with a CO. Now, here's the thing when we're looking at spinal nerves. If we look at the spinal nerves, let me just bring in a new screen here. Let's say here's our spinal cord. And now coming off the spinal cord, we have our spinal nerve. So just a reminder that the spinal nerve will bifurcate. It divides into this dorsal root with the dorsal root ganglion, and then a ventral root that comes to the front. So there's the ventral root. And here is the dorsal root. And now we get the spinal nerve. Almost immediately, that spinal nerve, it divides again, it branches off. And it will give rise to what we call a posterior or a dorsal ramus that goes to the back, and a ventral ramus that goes to the front, like this. So back here would be your dorsal branch, or dorsal ramus. And up here is a ventral branch, or a ventral ramus. Now the point is this. Anything along the back, that dorsal branch, goes directly to the muscles and the skin along your back. So for example, let's say you have some motor neurons. These motor neurons would start here in the anterior horn. Some of these motor neurons will come out here like this. Some will go to the ventral branch. They'll go to muscles up here. And some of them will come back like this, and they will go to the muscles along your back as well, just like that. And don't forget, we also have sensory neurons. These sensory neurons will be connecting to the receptors along the back of your skin, right there. So anything along your backside will be going through that dorsal ramus. As for the ventral ramus, up here, this will be actually going through the major nerves that will be going to your upper limbs and your lower limbs, as well as to your anterior thoracic cage. So this will be going to the muscles in the skin of the upper and lower limbs. And the abdominal wall. Here's the deal. These ventral branches, these ventral rami, as they come off, they will form what I call a plexus. I'll talk about the plexus later on, but a plexus is basically where all the nerves come together, they get mixed up, and then they separate again. And I'll show you this is how we divide the major nerves of the spinal cord, by looking at these ventral rami. So don't worry about the dorsal rami right now. We're going to focus our attention on the ventral branches, or the ventral rami. So as we do, the first plexus that we're going to look at is coming off of C1, 2, 3, and 4. So if you imagine you have C1, C2, C3, and C4, they're going to start to come together, and then they'll give rise to these nerves. The major nerve that we're going to come here is called the phrenic nerve. And the phrenic nerve goes to your diaphragm. So this is going to allow you to breathe. Now you'll notice that the main fibers of the phrenic nerve are what we call C3 and C4 and C5, which is the major contributor from C4. So it goes C3, 4, and 5. I always like to say C3, C4, and C5, keep the diaphragm alive. That's allowing you to breathe. So if you end up breaking your neck, try to break it below C5. Otherwise, you may be on a ventilator to keep you breathing for assisted breathing. All right, that's the main thing for the cervical plexus up here in the neck. As we come down to the shoulders, now we have what we call the brachial plexus. The brachial plexus, just to show you what I mean, I'm going to just put another screen in here. This is derived from C5, 6, 7, 8, and T1. So it goes from C5 to T1. And here's what happens. The nerves from C5 and C6 come together like this, and they form a trunk. The nerves from C8 and T1 also come together to form a trunk. C7 remains unbranched. And then you're going to get some fibers from this trunk here, merging with this guy here, and this guy here, merging with this guy here. So what we're starting to see, this is a plexus. Now, I don't care that you know what they look like or where they're going. I just want to give you the general idea that the nerves are all mixing together before they separate. The nerves that I want you to know from the brachial plexus are the following. Number 1, the radial nerve. The radial nerve, if you guys remember, is going to go laterally along the forearm by the thumb, and it goes to the extensors of the wrist. What that means, it allows you to extend your wrist like this. The next nerve is the median nerve. And the median nerve goes to the flexors of the wrist. And the flex of the wrist allow you to flex the wrist. Now, if you guys remember that the median nerve will go through a narrow passage through your arm, through your hand, called the carpal tunnel. And this is the one that gets compressed with carpal tunnel syndrome. And last but definitely not least, the ulnar nerve. Ulnar nerve is going to the muscles of the hand as well. Ulnar nerve. By the way, the ulnar nerve is what passes right through your elbow. And when you hit it, this is what we like to think of as the funny bone. So there it is. All right, I'm going to leave it here, guys. I just wanted to give you a general idea of what a plexus was and what we're talking about with the plexus. So there's a cervical plexus, a brachial plexus. In the lower back, there's a lumbosacral plexus. And just remember the lumbosacral plexus will give rise to your largest nerve, the sciatic nerve. All right, but that's going to be it. I'm out of time for this semester. So hopefully you guys have learned a little thing today. I know we covered a lot of ground, but like I said, anything I did not get to, I will not ask you about. And so I want to end it here for this day. You guys enjoy the rest of your week. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to ask. I'll hang around here for a few minutes just in case you do. Otherwise, enjoy this nice weather outside. I'll see you guys later. I'll stop my recording.